Thank you very much. First, thanks for having me here, and thanks for the impeccable organization of the conference. My name is Anastas Vangeli. I'm otherwise a doctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw, and I'm also currently a civil society scholar of the Open Society Foundation, but I'm here in the capacity of an associate researcher at the Torino World Affairs Institute, where I contribute to a very interesting project called IEMed. Very appropriately. And later on, I'll provide on the slides the link. You can check out the project where we have actually a huge database, not just raw data on China-Mediterranean cooperation, but also we try to get different perspectives from China and from the different countries. And we translate the original sources into English, so they're accessible to researchers. Anyway, of course, the Mediterranean is a very large region, so within ChinaMed we have different sections of the Mediterranean where I'm in charge of the Balkan section, and by Balkan I mean not just the Western Balkans, but also the wider Balkan region, including Greece, even some would say Turkey, and so on. Though here today given the time constraints and what I know best, I'll focus mostly on the Western Balkans. And I was informed that the audience is not here, and of course this is a Mediterranean forum, so the audience is not too much into China, so if you'll forgive me that I'll briefly have to give the background, so I also make the work easier for the participants later. So when we talk about China today, we have to take in account the trajectory of China as a global actor, which is of course, you cannot talk about it without talking about the Chinese economic miracle or the China's trajectory following 1978. In 1978, roughly, the Chinese leadership initiated the process of reform and opening up. Long story short, by getting foreign capital into the country, by focusing on industrialization, developing strong production capacities, adopting export-oriented strategy, China has managed to basically achieve double-digit growth for close to 3 decades, and only recently has been slowing down to a new normal, so-called, which is still pretty high, above 6.5% GDP growth annually, which has allowed China to become a very comfortable actor on the global stage, currently second largest economy, largest trader, one of the largest investors overseas, largest holder of currency reserves, and the rest is, you can also see it more and more in the news. Some particular events that catalyzed the rise of China on the global stage in the 21st century was the accession to the World Trade Organization. Basically, in 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization, and the expectation by the West was that this would lead to China adopting more liberal approach and adjusting to the global rules. What happened is, on the very short term, China got an immense boost in terms of trade, which led to even further growth, but it didn't lead to China adopting fully the Western rules, which we can talk about that later. The global financial crisis, which had terrible effects, especially on the northern Mediterranean shore, in this country included, left China relatively unscathed because of the large stimulus package the Chinese government provided. And more even so, in the aftermath of the crisis, China emerged as one of the largest creditors to developing nations, but also as one of the actors, for instance, in the operation to save the Eurozone. And of course, the emergence of protectionist, nationalist, isolationist sentiments in the West, which kind of culminated with the election of Donald Trump, has further boosted China's status on the international stage as the largest country that promotes some kind of globalization and some kind of trade and linkages. The person who is now the undisputed leader of China, the President Xi Jinping. Recently in the news there was the information that there is no more term limits, so he's going to, likely to serve, now he's starting the second term, he's probably going to serve third term, we'll see for more. Anyway, Xi Jinping has become the symbol of this new position of China on the global stage. Basically, if China before had a policy of keeping a low profile, that was especially a result of the Tiananmen events and the pressures from the West. Under Xi Jinping, China regains its confidence and inaugurated a policy that Chinese scholars call striving for achievement, which is based on the idea of adjusting the role of China in the global economy and outgrowing the export-led model into a more in a model based on state investment and development, basically renegotiating also a lot of the linkages with other parts of the world from short-term profits to long-term economic strategy, offering a particular idea how things can be solved abroad, or what is called offering Chinese wisdom to others. And of course, a diplomatic practice that is accompanied by building new institutions, new mechanisms, and new platforms that engage other actors on Chinese terms. And this is where we come to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think is probably the best way to approach China's Mediterranean vision and China's policy in the Balkans. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very comprehensive foreign policy endeavor that was initiated officially in 2013 with a speech by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan, where he announced the Silk Road Economic Belt, which refers to the construction of very complex economic corridors across the Eurasian landmass. And very soon after in Indonesia, he announced the Maritime Silk Road, which refers to building maritime linkages from the Pacific through the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The Belt and Road was developing in the next few years. Last year there was the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, which kind of positioned Belt and Road as a proto-international organization. And soon after, it was also codified in the constitution of the Communist Party, meaning that's one of the national priorities for China. There are different debates on the terminology, how to call the Belt and Road. What is important out of this thing that I've singled out, the Chinese insist on the term initiative, and some of them call it proposal, which refers to the idea that this is something that is still open-ended and has the possibility to be modified, and that it's not something that China imposes onto others. And therefore, there is a dislike among Chinese experts for the term strategy, because it has connotations that sound a bit militaristic or cunning or whatnot. And of course, Belt and Road is not a project, but it's actually a lot of projects combined, meaning that there is difference what the Belt and Road means, let's say, in Pakistan, and what it means in Greece, and what it means in Hungary, and what it means in Africa. In some places it's focused more on development aid, some places it's focused more on trade, some places it's ports, and so on. And there is debate whether the Belt and Road is some kind of a counterpart of the Marshall Plan. Of course, the Belt and Road is much larger in terms of scope and in terms of finance, and is happening in a different context. Another thing is how new is the Belt and Road. If you dwell actually in the policies and the concrete projects, you can find that a lot of these things were happening before the Belt and Road was announced. So in a way, this is more of the Belt and Road as such is a rhetorical figure to basically give a name to what China has been doing. And these are the geographical areas. This is one of the maps. The important thing is there is no one definite map issued by Chinese authorities what is the Belt and Road, because, as I said, it's very open-ended. This is one of the maps. Of course, to this you should add also Latin America, you should add the Arctic, because these are also areas where China is considering to build the Belt and Road. Of course, the Mediterranean Sea is pretty important, and it's very, I'll skip the part about the logic. It's very important that when we talk about China and Mediterranean, we should take into account the Chinese vision of the Mediterranean, and it's basically a vision of an enlarged region. So basically for China, the Mediterranean starts in the Indian Ocean. And then the Gulf of Aden. Djibouti is, let's say, one of the entrance points. Djibouti is a place where China has already built a military base, and when it comes, let's say, to the northern shore, where does the Mediterranean end? As I'll talk in a bit, it's the Balkans, but for them, it's not separable, let's say, from Central Europe, and it's not separable even from the rest of Europe. So it's not a vision of the Mediterranean based on a certain closed understanding, but it's more of a region that is expanding, and it's more about, when they talk about the Mediterranean, it's more about shifting the gravity back to the Mediterranean. Because, I mean, historically, this was the area with a lot of linkages and a lot of transportations. The central feature of the Belt and Road, very importantly, is connectivity. So this whole initiative is about building linkages or rebuilding linkages, as I said, shifting the points of gravity of economic and political relations. So by connectivity, usually what's in the news is, of course, infrastructure. But if you analyze the documents and the policies of China, it's also about connectivity of markets, connectivity of people, connectivity, importantly, of ideas, facilities, businesses, and so on. And when we talk about the infrastructure development as one of the landmarks of the Chinese new diplomacy, we have to also refer to the Chinese development logic and rhetoric. So very often the Chinese government officials would say, if you want to develop, you should build the roads first. And this is not something new. This is, you can also see it in many other schools of economic thought. But this is something they really emphasize, because it was also the case with China. It could not embark on the economic miracle without investing in infrastructure. Information technologies play a big role in this new strategy, including e-commerce, which is another thing that China is championing, and so on. And of course, the creation of economy of scale, especially in regions such as the Balkans, as we come shortly, where there's a lot of small divided countries. The idea is that they cannot be engaged in any economic cooperation on their own. They have to be part of something big. And of course, this is not contradictory to what's been happening in Europe in the last more than half a century, building a joint market. And importantly, when we talk about, let's say, the Mediterranean, is the interpretation. So when usually you talk about the Mediterranean in different venues, there is the idea, aside from the historical interpretations, when it comes to current affairs, it's all about conflict, it's about refugees, it's about wars. But for China, these are topics that are on the side. The main thing is, let's see how we can make business, how we can do economic potentials and build linkages. And of course, it's very important to know that whatever China does now and labels Belt and Road has been taking place for a while now, as mentioned earlier. The particularity of the northern shore, which is the European shore of the Mediterranean, is that there is increased diplomacy with focus on the Belt and Road. I mean, there is in general increased diplomacy between China and these countries, which especially dates back to the Eurozone. At least in the case of Greece, that was the time when the debt crisis pushed the Greek government to explore opportunities, and China was one of the sources of capital. So this was a very important turning point. And after the crisis, there was very big demand for capital in this part of Europe, including Italy, Spain, and this is when Chinese investors were coming in increased numbers. The specific projects of the Belt and Road is ports. So everyone probably heard about the Piraeus port in Greece, a major acquisition by the state-owned enterprise COSCO from China, but COSCO has been active in pursuing deals elsewhere in the Mediterranean. So in Spain, you had the Noatum ports. one of the ports in Valencia and I don't know which other cities where now I think the majority stake is owned by COSCO. There's the 5 Ports Alliance between Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia. So it's Trieste, Venice, Kopar, and a couple of others. And of course, the focus is not just on ports, but also linking the ports to the landmass, so the intermodal transportation. So it's not also building railways from the ports, highways, and so on. Another pillar is the acquisition of companies and technology, especially in the developed European economies, setting up own research centers and people-to-people exchange, which involves a lot of areas. Tourism is one thing, which I think is particularly important, at least in Spain, but also education, think tanks, and so on. The Balkans as a particular region within China's Mediterranean vision. Usually you don't talk about the Balkans in the context of Mediterranean, and usually you don't talk about the Balkans in the context of global economic linkages. And this is the important change that China brings to the table, but say by involving the Balkan countries in various forms of cooperation focused on boosting economic linkages. Moreover, the Balkans is framed by China as a region of exceptional importance because it is not only part of the Mediterranean strategy, but it's also part of another initiative China is pursuing in Eastern Europe, which is called 16+1, is a cooperation with a lot of post-socialist countries, 16 of them, based on the certain structural similarities, also inspired by the history of cooperation they had before 1989. So a lot of the post-communist countries of the Balkans are also involved in that initiative. Of course, when you talk about the Balkan region, one thing that comes to the mind, at least in economic terms, is underdevelopment. According to a recent study of the IEMed, huge infrastructure gap, and this is where the interests of the Balkan countries and China come together. So there is a complementarity between the two sides, at least in the realm of infrastructure development. When you talk about the Balkans, you also often have the narrative of the Balkans as an area of competition of different global powers. You had the US having a particular role after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Of course, the Balkan countries are either EU members or candidate for EU membership, so the EU, Western Europe, Germany in particular is an important actor. Recently we hear a lot about Russia. Turkey is there because of the historical linkages and interests, but you know, China is different. All these actors discuss strategic issues, high politics, very often ethnic issues, and again, this is something that is not part of the Chinese discourse, which is strictly economic in nature. And the way China has been developing the cooperation with the Balkan countries is again different from all other actors, which have used not only strategic linkages, but also various forms of conditionality, especially EU and the US, and have basically explored when it comes to, let's say, the international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, have provided a development model also based on sticks and carrots and imposed reforms that were not organic, but you know, based on external inputs. So in the case of China, all these ideas, all these projects have been negotiated in a rather low-key manner, at least in their public portrayal. So it's more about the socialization of political elites, think tank elites, and a lot of symbolic power based on ceremonial, ritualistic meetings, especially when it comes to the 16+1 cooperation. Just a quick information about it. I don't know how much time do we? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. The 16+1, I think, is important when we talk about the Balkans, because it's one of these novel Chinese institutions which, as I said, I can quickly name the 16 countries that are part of it: Albania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Macedonia, Montenegro, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Slovenia, and I missed one. Moldova is not, because it's considered to be part of the Russian sphere of interest. These are all EU members or potential EU members. So Romania, Poland, of course. Yeah. Anyway, so this is a platform that has emerged quite surprisingly in 2012 and has ever since developed through annual summits and a lot of sectorial dialogues in a very quasi-institutional way. And this is a blueprint for the Chinese institution building, basically. And it's much more developed compared, let's say, to the platform that China has for cooperation with Africa or with Latin America. And the goal has been to achieve various ways of policy coordination and facilitation of different measures with the goal to boost economic flows. So basically you have, after the crisis, China realized that something had to change because these countries reached their maximum in the relations with China. So one way has been to do what they know best. Okay, get the governments together and see what policy measures can be taken to, let's say, boost trade, boost investment, and create new opportunities, synergies, and so on. At the same time, it has been established before the Belt and Road, which also had the purpose of serving as a laboratory. So if you see how the Belt and Road is being developed, it has followed a lot of the logic of 16+1. And the Balkan countries have had a particular role in 16+1 because they're not EU member states, the Western Balkan countries at least. So they have been much more flexible in terms of the legislation and the measures undertaken. What cannot be done, let's say, in the EU can be done in these countries for China. So this is the map of 16+1. There are also observer countries. Greece is one. Probably Italy should be by now considered observer. Austria as well. So it's a very important regional initiative, which I think is inseparable from the relations with the Mediterranean as well. I mean, aside from the fact that it involves the Adriatic coast, it's as I said, for China, everything is intertwined, so you cannot see one thing without taking account the other. It's not like, I think that's one of the important paradigmatic differences in Europe. Everything is kind of separated, and for China, everything is a holistic thing. And some of the key concepts, I said the economic orientation, which is a complete reframing of the region. Again, the Balkans is just the mentioning of the Balkans is already arousing certain ideas in people's heads. But for China, the Balkans has to do with completely different things. An important thing is the expected proactive participation. And this is important because these countries are countries that have for 25 years followed the policies of IMF, World Bank. They have invested everything in integrating EU, NATO. So they didn't really have an opportunity to develop independent foreign policy or just to think of themselves as part of the world. And now they have to do that by dealing with China. In the process, China is providing them with equal treatment despite the huge asymmetry. So again, for the non-EU member states, it's actually a privilege to sit on an equal footing, not only with China, but also with other EU countries, because they are otherwise considered not Europe in EU. Again, a region that has been considered economic periphery now is reframed as an important land bridge intersection. That's also a novelty. We discussed about the build the roads first concept. Production capacity cooperation is another idea. Basically, this refers to the potential economic deals by pooling together resources. For example, a lot of these countries have devastated economic capacities, rusty economic capacities. China has the know-how and the capital, And there is also an opportunity here to involve Europe. So that's why there is this triple win idea that basically we can use what's there to create new opportunities. The landmark project of China and the Balkans, which is also one of the landmark projects of the Belt and Road and China's new diplomacy in general. After the acquisition of the Piraeus port, there is this idea to connect Athens to Budapest by high-speed rail. And here is the map. And it's a very important map, because if you don't see this could be also a map of something else. This could be the Balkan route of migrants, right? Again, this, for me, in analysis, this visible element of reinterpreting the region has been a very important novelty brought by China. Anyway, so there is a lot of talk, of course, a lot of policy hurdles, but also a lot of pressures along the way of establishing this China-Europe Land Sea Express route, which is, we can maybe discuss it a bit later, because I think I'm running out of time. Highways, very important, pan-European corridors that are kind of left out by EU are now built with funds from China. Which of course brings an important risk of debt trap. And I think we can address maybe these questions, why EU has problems with China in the Balkans in the discussion. I'm sorry for overstepping the time limit. Because what I presented is from the perspective on China, maybe from the perspective of the Balkan countries, but seen from Brussels, this is very often problematized. And I'll just go quickly through the four arguments. One idea is that the new economic architecture that China is proposing is basically messing up with the existing architecture in Europe. So let's say if you talk to Dutch people, they say, yeah, it's very good that China is building Piraeus and the routes in the Balkans, but what does it imply for the Netherlands? What does it imply for Rotterdam? Or the same thing here in Hamburg. When it comes to all these projects, I didn't explain the tight model of financing, but basically these projects, the construction of railways, highways, are all carried out by Chinese companies, and this is basically taking away business from European companies, and this is another line of concern. Investing in European companies now is considered a security issue, especially with the acquisition. This doesn't refer so much to the Balkans, but let's say to the other parts of the European shore of the Mediterranean. Investing in robotics, investing in high technology is considered a security question. And in the Balkans, acquiring some smaller capacities is also considered intercepting supply chains, which is in the new discourse in Europe a security issue. The state-led development model and economic cooperation by states is considered to confront the market-driven model and opens questions about transparency and so on. And of course, there is the perennial question in Europe, how to speak on China with one voice. If different parts of Europe develop different understanding and have different interests with China, it's very hard to have one voice. Again, I apologize for overstepping the time limit. I'd be very willing to discuss much more in the